He says, indeed, all the prophets from Samuel on, as many as have spoken, have foretold these days. And you are heirs of the prophets of the covenant God made with your fathers. He said to Abraham, through your offspring, all peoples on earth will be blessed. When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. Sisters and brothers, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Did you know that on February 5th, 2017, perhaps this Sunday a year ago, I stood in front of you giving you my sermon, and you voted on me, and one of you voted no, but the rest of you voted yes. Maybe it was my wife who voted no. There's this joke amongst clergy that when you're called to a congregation and it's a unanimous vote, that's a sign of bad luck. So maybe someone knowing that voted no. But it has been a pleasure to be with you. My first Sunday in this pulpit was March 26th. So as I reflect back upon this year, it's been a wonderful blessing. This community has been so wonderful to me and my family. And we've come here believing that God has called us here. And I believe that God is calling this congregation to something good and to something vibrant and vital. So for the past year or so, we've been getting to know one another. We've been getting to know my preaching style, my character. I've been getting to know you. And it is my privilege with excitement to share with you that about a year into it, the session has said, okay, it's time to start thinking forward. Where is Covenant Church going to be going? So on Saturday, February the 24th, our session members are going out and we're spending a day praying, reading scriptures, putting down some ideas, thoughts, goals, objectives on paper, believing this is where we're going to go as God is calling us into the future. But I believe this about you, about Covenant, about any individual or organization. To know where you're going, let's see if I turn this on. To discern where you're going, you've got to know where you've come from. So in my life, I am a proud hillbilly from West Virginia. And that has influenced me, affected me, made me into the person that I am. Whether it was good or not is regardless of that's where I've come from. And to know where I'm going, to know where we're going, we got to know where I've come from. So I found some old pictures. If you don't know, this congregation is relatively young in terms of Presbyterian churches. We were chartered in 1979. And can you believe that this picture is the community that surrounds us? I think this picture was taken around 1982 or 1983. And standing beside the sign that says sanctuary is the first installed pastor of this church, the Reverend Dr. Alan Swan. And there are some faces back there. Maybe Phil Riebold or someone can help me with those faces. It wasn't that long ago that this building didn't exist, that this church didn't exist. There's Dr. Swan praying at the groundbreaking, surrounded by a group of folks in prayer, looking forward to what God has in store for this church, for you. I have learned that this sanctuary is relatively new. Some of you already know that. When that sanctuary was built by the original folks, they met out in the foyer. And this is a picture of that. So when you go out into the foyer after worship, that cross on the wall back here was right in front of the pulpit and the communion table, because this church met right out there. And it's rather humble beginnings. There's a church being built. Beautiful. We're looking at it from that angle before some classrooms were built. And then our next photo is when this edition was being put on, roughly the year 2000. This concrete pad is about right back here. So for the past 40 years, folks on the west side of Boise have said, we believe that God has called us here to form a church. And over the past 40 years, we've grown. We've had some problems. But God has been incredibly faithful. So as the session on February 24th thinks about praise, where are we going? It's important to remember the faithfulness of those who have gone before us, who organized us in the past. Because to discern where you're going, you've got to know where you've come from. So it's this picture that strikes me. Some founding members of this church praying at around this space of which we're gathered this morning. And I believe that the efficacy of those prayers in roughly 1983 continue to bear fruit in the hearts of you sitting here today. And as they began, or perhaps continued, God's call, for some reason, and I want to talk with some of you charter members, they agreed on the name Covenant Presbyterian Church. Covenant. And I believe that there is incredible value in recognizing not just the efforts of those Presbyterians in the late 70s and early 80s, but where does this biblical idea of covenant come from? Because it hits the nail on the head of a primary theological issue, promise, blessing of what it means to be covenant people. Not just Presbyterians, but what does it mean to be the covenant people of God? You know, in the Old Testament, this word is mentioned over 284 times. In the New Testament, it's brought up 33 times. And scholars will debate about how many covenants there are. But if you were to ask me, I think that there are 4 primary covenants that God makes with God's people. And the first is this: when we use covenant language, we know the story of Noah and how God flooded the earth to rid itself of wickedness and evil. Then the story goes that God put a rainbow in the sign and told Noah, this is my covenant with you, a sign of the covenant that I will never again destroy the earth with water. So I believe that's one of the first primary covenants that God makes. The second is the covenant with Abraham that's alluded to in the scripture passage that I read from Acts. Peter is after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Peter's preaching, and he's talking to the Jews. He says, this person that you've crucified has been raised and resurrected and gone to heaven, and you are the covenant people. You are heirs of the covenant. You are blessed to be a blessing. And that's the covenant that Janet read for us in Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Father Abraham and says, I have blessed you so that you will be a blessing. So this second covenant is about blessing. You are blessed to be a blessing. Remember that. You are blessed to be a blessing. The third is this. The scriptures in the Old Testament reveal the covenant language in the Bible alludes to the commandments that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. For all of you Indiana Jones fans, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're looking for the Ark of the Covenant. This is where our Jewish ancestors kept the 10 Commandments, and they built this elaborate ark, and they carried it around with them. The covenant for the people of Moses were all those commandments, the covenant. And then finally, we're New Testament folks. So we believe that there is another covenant revealed in the person of Jesus, when in the Gospels, during a meal that we're going to practice later, Jesus says, this is the cup of the new covenant, sealed in my blood. For you early covenant Presbyterian church folks, did you know that you were digging into something incredibly biblical that speaks to something not just about this church, but about God's people? I would love to hear that from you later. Well, let's talk about covenants. What are they about? Covenants are about relationships. I believe that. Now, in the Bible, we hear all about covenants with God, but the term that the Hebrews use is berith, and this term, used 285 times, is not just about people with God, but it is about people with God, etc. It's a term that could be used to define an alliance, or an agreement, or an eternal theological covenant with God's people. The etymology going back even deeper, berith, if you were to literally translate it from the Hebrew into the English, is a cut. And perhaps you've heard this, I'm going to cut a deal, and I'm going to cut a really good deal. It's a cut, or it's a binding. And scholars believe that these literal translations go back to a very ancient practice, that when the ancients made an agreement, it was important and meaningful and binding. So agreements that were really important would be celebrated with a sacrifice. And this shows up in our Old Testament. Let's read about Moses. After he's just received the law, Scriptures say this: when Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. It gets even bloodier and messier. Moses took half of the blood and put it in the bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." And then Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So when the ancients are creating covenants with each other or with God, they would do these animal sacrifices. They were bloody. They were messy. For us modern folks, we may cringe at the idea of sacrifices and binding commitments with blood of the animals. And this is a very ancient practice. We don't do it today. But this concept, I think, speaks clearly to the nature of covenantal relationships that we have with God and one another. Berith, to cut. Covenant relationships are not pretty and beautiful. In fact, they are sometimes very bloody and very often messy. So think about the covenant relationships that you have in your own life. I love my wife, Chrissy, and we do a pretty good job of putting on a good act, and I don't think it's an act most of the time. But we don't dare tell you what happens in our house at 10:30 at night after we put the kids to bed, because it gets a little messy between the kids and one another, right? And as I think about my covenant relationship with God, and reflect upon my own brokenness, my relationship with God isn't simple. It isn't always beautiful. In fact, it is usually pretty messy. That's how it is in covenant relationships. So I want to take a moment to point out some things from the Old Testament that keeps us moving forward. Theologically, as we speak about covenants, they're usually with God. They're about relationships, and they're really messy. So let's think about that covenant that God made with Abram. He said this to Abraham: Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will bless you into a great nation, and I will bless you, or I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And all peoples on earth will be blessed by you. So as we talk about covenants, the last thing that I want to put down here is that our covenants with God are always about blessing. Even though they're messy, they're always about blessing. Usually there are signs of the covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant was a sign of God's presence. What was the sign of this covenant in the Old Testament? Does anyone know? What's the sign of this Abrahamic covenant? Now, some of y'all know, I know this. If you take what we've talked about thus far, maybe you're just a little afraid to say circumcision in church, right? But that's the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 17:9. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant of blessing, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised. Talking about bloody and messy, right? And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Now, next week we're going to dig deeper into this notion of the covenant, because we know that in the New Testament, Paul says you don't have to be circumcised anymore, but there is another sign of the covenant. You think it's just for show that I have a child come up and say that we are the baptized children of God? That is an intense theological meaning, because if we don't remember that we are the baptized children of God, we have no idea what God has in store for us where we're going. There's that picture again. People standing right here praying for this building, but more importantly, praying for you and what God has in store. If you know the history of people and yourself, you know that relationships are often messy. In our covenant relationship with God, we are not the faithful actor, are we? In our covenant relationship with each other, sometimes we get into squabbles, we get frustrated with each other, sometimes we even have fights, sometimes people even leave the church, right? But God says we are the covenant people of God, and as we think about our relationship to God, there is always one actor who is faithful, and that is Yahweh, the creator of the universe, the one who in every covenant that God makes, God is the faithful actor. When the Israelites were unfaithful to the laws, did God give up on them? By no means. God is always our faithful actor. So friends, the sermon's not complete because we need to go into next week. But we've learned some things about what it means to be the covenant people of God. God is faithful. The covenant is about blessing. The covenant is about relationship. So where are we going? A few things before I end. I'll be brief. Where are we going? As a church, we're going to remember that we've been blessed to be a blessing. That we're not in it for the people of Israel ourselves, because God said to Father Abraham, through you, you are going to be a blessing to all nations. Folks, we've got some work to do. But the sermon is not just about our congregation. The sermon is, more importantly, about you. From where have you come from? Children of the covenant. And where is God going to take you? You'll notice that on these bright new sermon or bulletin covers, colorful, the name of the sermon series is Covenant Love. And because I believe that sometimes our relationships are messy, and and sometimes life is messy, it's important to talk about those things in the context of faith. So from now until Easter, in this Covenant Love series, we'll have another little academic sermon next week, and then for about a period of 5 weeks or so, we're going to hear from people with whom we are in a covenant relationship with at church, talking about the messiness of life, talking about God's covenant love in the midst of divorce, God's covenant love in the death of a spouse, God's covenant love when we are faced with critical turning points in our lives or the lives of a family. And we're going to hear from people that are not necessarily me, but they're going to talk about how in the messiness of life, God's faithfulness is sure, even when we don't. Friends, covenant love. How has God called you to ponder your own covenant relationship with God, with others? And we give thanks to God for the question. Amen.